Okay, so I think we can get started. So first and foremost, I want to welcome everybody into the room today. For those who don't know, my name is Toni Morgan. I'm the Managing Director at the Center for Law, Innovation, and Creativity in Boston, Massachusetts. I know that we have folks who've registered for this session from across the country, and so I welcome you and thank you for joining us this afternoon. So for those who don't know, the Center for Law, Innovation, and Creativity focuses on intellectual property and technology with a particular focus on privacy. We support students, scholars, university partners, and many more in our mission to amplify research and practice around the ways that intellectual property and technology is being used in the world today. But what makes CLIC particularly distinct is that we are housed at Northeastern University School of Law, a school focused on public interest and social justice. And so our work is IP and tech law and privacy law through the lens of social justice and public interest. So you'll notice that a lot of the work, if you've gone to visited CLIC's website, northeastern.edu/CLIC, C-L-I-C, you'll see that there is certainly a public interest focus in the way that we talk about the world of technology law and the world of intellectual property and creativity. And so that leads to today. Scrutinizing Surveillance is our summer series that focuses on the proliferation of tools that gather data about us, our preferences, our movements, our behaviors through the deployment of technology. And today's topic explores protests, big data, and data journalism specifically. And we are delighted to partner with our colleagues at the Center for Public Interest, Public Interest in Advocacy and Collaboration, CPIAC for short, to produce this event. I want to turn this over to introduce my colleague, Shannon Al-Wakil, CPIAC's Managing Director.
Thanks, Toni, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Shannon Al-Wakil, Managing Director of the Center for Public Interest Advocacy and Collaboration, as Toni referenced. We act as a hub for social justice endeavors at the law school and beyond. At Northeastern, we engage in a lot of interdisciplinary work, including on voting rights and on dismantling the cradle-to-prison pipeline. I'm very excited to have us partner with CLIC in this event. I'm really a big fan of CLIC's work on surveillance in particular, and just excited to hear from you all.
Fantastic. So I just want to set a little bit of the context for this particular panel and then introduce our guests. So the pandemic has created a world where we are all trying to figure out and struggling and racing to find a solution to a global problem. And at the same time, we are facing a global uprising and have witnessed a global uprising against systemic racism in solidarity with the movement for Black lives. This is in addition to what we are now witnessing as a political response to those protests that have turned cities like Portland and DC before that into sites that raise questions about the future and stability of our democratic systems. All of this in an election year. And so folks, I think we've heard it before. We heard it in 2008. We've heard it in so many instances before when the world has had to come to terms with an unstable, untenuous situation that, you know, we're in an unprecedented time. But I think this time we can say unequivocally, unflinchingly, with conviction and confidence that this is in fact an unprecedented time. And so today's panel was organized in direct response to what is happening in our world right now today, but in particular with what many of us witnessed on May 26, 2020, with the death of George Floyd, a 46-year-old Minneapolis resident who suffocated to death at the hands of a member of the Minneapolis Police Department after a store clerk didn't trust that Floyd's $20 bill was real legal tender. And so the global response to Floyd's death and in support of the response to George Floyd's death in response to the movement and support for Black lives has launched the largest global movement for racial solidarity in history. But it also launched something else. Increasingly, as our smartphones are capturing these instances and patterns of injustice, excuse me, we are also seeing the data from our phones and our social feeds being used by tech companies, law enforcement, and countless institutions to track and trace private citizens. We know now that there are many ways that data can be used and weaponized against private citizens, and as this data is being collected, we are witnessing a new era in big data. And so we are in an unprecedented time with this new proliferation of the weaponization and the use of big data. And some people say that this has always been, you know, this culture of surveillance has always been in operation. And then there are some that are saying that technology and the proliferation of technology and the tools around this has actually created a much more dangerous new moment for us as we experience this together, while many of us are in quarantine and living most of our lives online. So the question here is, how does big data impact our civil rights? How does it impact our civil liberties? How does it impact our relationships? And what role does it play, big data play, in the narratives that shape who we are, our communities, and even the stories we hold about law enforcement and the use of the use of force by law enforcement. So with that said, I'm pleased to be joined by our three panelists to discuss these questions and others. First, I'll introduce Rashida Richardson. As of recently, congratulations, Rashida. Rashida is a visiting scholar at Rutgers Law School and Rutgers Institute for Information Policy and Technology, where she specializes in race, emerging technologies, and the law. She's also a fellow in the Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative at the German Marshall Fund. Rashida researches the social and civil rights implications of data-driven technologies, including artificial intelligence, and develops policy interventions and regulatory strategies regarding data-driven tech, government surveillance, racial discrimination, and the technology sector. Welcome, Rashida. I also want to introduce our second panelist, Lindsay Gribal, excuse me. Lindsay is a rising third-year law student at Northeastern University School of Law. She is currently co-oping at the Center for Civil Rights and Restorative Justice, investigating cold cases of racially motivated homicides during the 1930s to the 1970s. Over the winter, she worked at the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, STOP for short, at the Urban Justice Center in New York City. While at STOP, Lindsay did extensive research about government use of automated decision-making systems and advocated for the passage of various of privacy legislation at New York City Council meetings, and worked on writing legislation to ban the use of reverse location search warrants. Lindsay is passionate about the intersection of privacy rights and civil rights, and before attending law school, she worked as an LGBTQIA domestic violence advocate and earned her Master of Education. Welcome, Lindsay. Finally, we have John Wibbey. Professor John Wibbey is an assistant professor of journalism and media innovation at Northeastern University, where he heads the graduate programs in the School of Journalism. He is the author of The Social Fact, News and Knowledge in a Networked World. He's an affiliate of Northeastern School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, and is also faculty co-director of Northeastern's Co-Laboratory for Data Impact. He serves as a consultant to Twitter and is the principal investigator for the ongoing project through Northeastern's Ethics Institute that is studying content labeling on social media platforms. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our panelists. So we are going to start this by asking our panelists just to provide some remarks to give the audience some context about their work and their position, and obviously with particular focus on the theme for today. We are going to start with Rashida.
Hi, and thank you. I'll first start with giving a little bit of a description of what I do, because as you were reading my bio, I was like, oh, that's a tongue twister. So my background is as a civil rights lawyer. I actually went to Northeastern, so shout out to all of you there. And I've worked on a range of issues from criminal justice reform, fair housing, HIV criminalization, schools desegregation. And I always start by framing that because I think by having a strong foundation in a lot of social justice issues, it also allowed me to see how tech was becoming more entrenched in each sector, not just in law enforcement, which is often the focus. And then I moved to be the director of policy research at the AI Now Institute, which is an interdisciplinary research institute based at NYU that focuses on the social implications of artificial intelligence, and that kind of allowed me to expand my work. So I both perform research looking at mostly government use of different data-driven technologies. So I've written a paper about predictive analytics in policing, but I've also looked at it in child welfare and other sectors. And then I also do research on different forms of regulatory reform. So one example is a paper I'm writing right now that's trying to define the term automated decision systems for regulatory and legislative purposes. And even though that sounds really boring, honestly, it's actually really important and responsive to what's going on in government, because so much of the debates around whether or not to use certain technologies or how they should be regulated is distracted. The conversation about the harms and the substance of these issues are often distracted or moved away by just focusing on how do we even define an algorithm or whatever we're talking about. So that's sort of the realm of regulatory reform. And then I try to make sure that that research that I'm doing is in response to the conversations happening both in society and in government, because luckily I get to wear two hats. So I'm still active in working on policy efforts and trying to identify what is missing from these conversations, what are sort of the knowledge asymmetries, and how to break that down so we can have more structural reform so everyone can live equally in society. So how does all of that work relate to this topic? I think the most interesting place to start is I think we're in an interesting moment where we're seeing both the potential of technology and its many perils being amplified in such extremes. So on the potential end, it's kind of what you already discussed, Tony, of how we're seeing how the internet and social media applications have sort of allowed more access to information in the way that they traditionally were thought of the information age, allowing everyone to have access to information and act on it in a way. And in some ways, it's helped increase solidarity on issues that have really been stagnant for a long period of time. But at the same time, we see the problems of tech being so embedded in government, and also just society's move towards tech solutionism. So I think with COVID, we've seen kind of like government run to contact tracing apps, which don't work. And we can get into that if we want to during the panel discussion, but just that disconnect in thinking that technology can solve really complicated and nuanced social issues. We're seeing that happen at scale. I think a lot of the congressional hearings with big tech have kind of shown the problems with that business model and the lack of understanding and inability of government to really hone in or regulate that industry as a whole. And we're also kind of now seeing a pivot, and I think this is where we have even more opportunities, is that like I've been working on different forms of regulation for at least the past 5 to 6 years, and most things that I worked on I knew were going to be dead in water and not go anywhere for years. But now, because of sort of the global uprisings, increased solidarity around issues of racial justice, we're not only seeing conversations about the need for tech regulation go expanding beyond just the privacy frame, which has kind of been the main legal argument and main way of looking at these issues. And we're now seeing more robust discussion about how technology has kind of mediated the social inequities we see in society, but also more regulations and sort of interest in regulating government's use of these technologies, as well as we're seeing more of the failures of the surveillance state not working, but also government use of decisions or technologies and making decisions about who receives public benefits or which school you go to, and kind of seeing more mobilization around the use of technologies in those areas. So I do think we're at an interesting inflection point. It's going to be interesting to see where we go, and I hope we can talk more about what the opportunities are and some of those challenges throughout today.
Great, thank you, Rashida. Just last week we did we had our session, our Scrutinizing Surveillance session on COVID and contact tracing. And so I'm interested to hear what other comments you have about not only the this position or this orientation towards tech solutionism, but particularly how it's affecting our communities and how it's affecting our frame around the role of tech in solving big problems. So I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay. Thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, so just sharing a bit about how this moment, really thinking about the future of how this relates to just like what's happening in the world, is just have to always remember, and part of what you had said, Tony, really resonates with this, is that like surveillance is not new. It has just changed and adapted as tech has evolved and expanded exponentially. And so I think like looking at some of the historical things of how from the 18th century to today, the government and police have found ways to track and surveil the bodies of Black and brown people and people who are political dissenters. So from like Native Americans and enslaved Black people having to carry lanterns, after sundown, to new forms of facial recognition software today, technology has just continued to adapt to surveil communities of color, poor people, LGBTQ people, people who have migrated here, and people with disabilities. So, and COVID has just really, I think, expedited this process in a number of ways, and has shown a lot of the failings of technology and how thinking about contact tracing and all of those things, some of those things have already been said, but knowing who's around you who has tested positive for COVID may be important for public health reasons, but what is all of the data that's being collected around that in tracing people and where they're at and when they're there? And so we always have to, I feel like, ask, or the question I always want to ask myself is, how else will this be used? So just because the way that something is marketed and how, what its current function is not always what the end result will be and where it will end up and how else it will be manipulated. And so just knowing who will gather this information, who will profit from the information, how can it be bought and sold, and what is the future of where people are going to be, are these new forms of technology that are being offered, how will that continue to change and grow for the future? So I think that's a lot of how seeing what's happening now, like we're connecting all digitally, doing organizing work about, against police brutality, and relying on those remote connections. It's really scary to wonder, how is our privacy going to be ensured throughout that process when we have to rely on these places that we know have are owned by private companies or those kinds of things.
Thank you, Lindsay. All really important questions that I hope we'll get into. I'm going to turn it over to John.
Thanks, Tony. And I really enjoyed Rashida and Lindsay's remarks. There's so much to chew over. So I'm trying to figure out how to kind of plug in. So I guess I'm on the panel because I kind of cover the landscape of journalism, and particularly the intersection of social media and news media. And obviously, this is a really consequential moment for journalism as an institution, both in the United States, but also around the world. And, I sort of start from the standpoint of trying to think about how journalism can facilitate the sort of highest, best kind of public good in an age of networks and in an age of social media. And so my sort of first principle is that I think that what journalism does is it helps facilitate what I'm calling networks of recognition. And this is an idea that I think is rooted in a kind of notion about what democracy needs. In the older kind of social science literature, they might call it issue publics. We might call them sort of hashtag publics now. My colleagues, Sarah Jackson, Brooke Wells, and Moya Bailey, have talked about counter publics. And so I'm really interested in how journalists can help amplify, average people who are witnessing gathering, protesting, and all of this. And not just in the racial justice movement, but in many other spheres, whether it's environment, education, healthcare. So I'm seeing this moment as a real sort of, as Rashida says, sort of an inflection point. I think journalism is starting to understand, and this is with respect to surveillance, that in order to activate these networks of recognition, people need granular knowledge of the world. They need to see things and hear things and experience things that are outside of their regular sphere of encounter. And that can form solidarity, as we've seen. But at the same time, that granular knowledge, which often comes from user-generated content, can be used as a surveillance tool. And so there's this real tension between sort of specific knowledge and for, I think, public good and formation of publics, and specific knowledge which can be used as an invasive tool to surveil persons who are already marginalized or who are coming into a sphere to support people who are marginalized. So I know that's a little bit academic, but I think it's sort of helps frame up our moment. So just on the negative side of things that I'm sort of worried about that are on my radar screen. Journalism being used, whether it's pictures and photojournalism or other forms of kind of bearing witness by law enforcement, by institutions of power, and sort of indiscriminate algorithms kind of vacuum up everything. And so, journalism ultimately aims to provide public accountability, but I think can also, and there's been some tension and controversy over photojournalism itself and who has the right to take pictures. So I think we're dealing with that ethically within the discipline. I'm also worried about, things like high-tech, like COVID heat maps, which are, the Marshall Project was reporting that those are being used actually in the context of trying to police protests. And so I've been thinking a little bit about kind of linked data and how sort of health data that is invasive to privacy and to persons' residences could be sort of married with other, facial recognition, other forms of kind of mobility monitoring to paint really, I think dangerous pictures without sufficient privacy protections. On the positive side, I would just say, journalists around the world, not just in the United States, but on the continent of Africa, are using forensic digital tools to try to reconstruct how institutions of power, whether that's security forces, are doing sort of repressive tactics. And this might mean like putting together lots of videos or images and studying them very carefully to see, who shot whom or how something was carried out. And so again, this granular knowledge can be a tremendous tool for public knowledge and for accountability. But and then just on data visualization, because I think, and then I'll stop talking. I'm interested in how these maps of the protests are able to at once communicate the scope of what's going on, which I think is a wonderful thing, because it shows that we are, as a society, I think deeply now invested in the movement for racial justice and social justice. But I am somewhat concerned, and this is something my students and I have been working on, because we're working on a data animation project. How data visualization, when you see a lot of big bubbles, let's say on the coast where a lot of protests are, you can start to say, well, oh, it's a coastal phenomenon. And so data visualization can communicate a lot of different things. And I'm just worried sometimes that if it's not communicated correctly, it can lead to dismissal by people who have priors in that direction. Anyway, that's what's on my mind.
Great, thank you. Thank you to our panelists. For those of you who are in the room, if you have questions, feel free to share them in the chat. You can also send them to me via private message, and we'll make sure that at the end, when we do the audience Q&A, that your question is asked. All right, and from this point, we're gonna turn it over to Shannon.
Thanks, Tony, and thank you so much, Rashida, Lindsay, and John, for prefacing your remarks with a lot of really interesting points to think about. How does this global moment, in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the solidarity for racial justice movement, and even related social justice movements that you may want to touch on. John, you spoke of environmentalism and some other global struggles. How does that shape the future of the information age as it relates to your respective areas of expertise or experience? And are there any key lessons that we're learning about the future of public interest tech or community justice through these current moments and movements for racial justice, police accountability, and abolition? Would you feel comfortable starting us off, Rashida?
Sure, there's a lot there, so I'll try. I think I'll touch on one point I made in the end of my opening remarks, in that I do think sort of the combination of different global things happening, whether you're talking about the pandemic, the economy, or sort of the at least global awakening to the fact that we have a racial justice problem in this world, are all, I think, helping force conversations that needed to be had in a lot of different sectors, and particularly in the technology sector. And that I think the way that we're talking about technological harms has expanded, where there's this understanding, or let me take a step back. I think part of the framing and rhetoric and narrative around technology generally, especially in the legal realm, has been focused on individual rights in this privacy framing, which tends to only look at data and how individuals may be impacted, which ignores sort of the societal, group, and community-based harms that come with both big data practices and the use of big data technologies. And it's forcing the conversation to expand beyond that type of limited framing. And I think that is sort of a great opening on policy reform in this area. And that, to give a few examples, I think until recently, or at least the past couple of years, a lot of the conversation around technology has been on digital divide, which tends to focus on access to technology. But there's now I have a term for it, digital disparities. This sociologist at Stanford, Forrest Stewart, I don't know if he really claimed it, but at least he named it in something I was reading recently. And that's actually talking about the way that technology mediates social inequities. So the fact that even if you have access to technology, the benefits and sort of risk that come with that use is different for different groups. So if you're part of a community that's been over-surveilled and over-profiled, you're over-represented in government databases, then how you're viewed by government and how that information is used is going to be different than communities that have had the luxury and privilege of less surveillance and less scrutiny from government. The same if you look at even social media use, and I don't use social media, so I'm sorry if I get the terms wrong or say things incorrectly, but it's an opportunity in that social media has even created a whole sector of fields and professions that didn't exist a decade ago, yet access to those opportunities is not equal for all, and how access and use is used is different for different groups. And that community, like marginalized communities and stigmatized communities, tend to almost have to amplify stereotypical and problematic views of themselves to help it be monetized in a way. And hopefully that's kind of shifting now with sort of the broader discussions we're having around racial justice, but also how that information is used by other actors is different, in that police may see a music video or a post by a young Black kid in Brooklyn as criminal activity, when it's just like, it's a kid being a kid, but that kid doesn't have the luxury of a white kid from Wyoming of just being a kid on the internet. So how do these technologies mediate and almost exacerbate social inequities in society, I think is something that the fact that we're all being quarantined and forced to have to communicate and use the internet and all of these different technological mediums in a way is expanding that conversation, and also expanding how we're talking about technology in a way that I do think can be really productive. But, and I'm sorry I'm going long, but this last point is also important and hopefully it can open the conversation. But I also see it being weaponized in a really problematic way where, like I was having a conversation with friends and then on this weird panel last week where we were talking about what's happening in Portland, and I'm like, I'm a little bothered by the narrative and media coverage because they don't even mention what people are protesting about anymore, and that distracts from the work that actually needs to be done, which is addressing structural harms and the need for structural reform. And instead we're talking about abuse by federal authority, abuse of power by federal authorities, or the white wall of moms, or anything that is kind of serving as a distraction. And I'm seeing that happen almost at scale where we're not talking about sort of the substantive issues that should be the focal point, or it's even distracting us from paying attention to ways that technology and oppressive practices are becoming re-entrenched in society. And an example of that is last week, the Chicago police announced that they were going to restart their hot spot policing program, which they just ended predictive policing a few months ago. So and they're marketing it as different because they're like, now we're working with community groups, even though the composition and culture of the police department hasn't changed. So the sort of concern with this sort of onslaught of information and the accessibility to everyone is that the work and messages that should be the focal rallying point around solidarity are almost being diluted. And what happens if we kind of lose this important moment we have, both with attention and changing of conversations, all because it's too much in a way. So that was a lot. I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Rashida. And I think I might actually ask John to address this question next, because you really helpfully, I think, provided a segue in terms of your referencing journalism and the way that information can overload and even detract from the conversation about the purpose of these protests, for example. John, do you feel comfortable going next? And would you let me know if you'd like me to restate the question, because I know it was long.
Sure.
Sure. So basically, wondered if you could speak to, and you began in your introduction a bit, but how does this moment, struggles for racial justice, the pandemic, environmentalism, or struggles for climate justice, I should say, shape the future of the information age? Or if you feel more comfortable really of journalism as it relates to social justice journalism, as it relates to your respective areas of expertise and experience. And are there any key lessons we're learning about the future of public interest tech or community justice through these current movements?
A lot of directions to go in. Maybe I'll, because I'm working in the kind of social media space, maybe I'll talk a little bit about sort of what's going on there, and maybe that. I think there's a big conversation on the with everybody on who's doing content moderation or policy for platforms like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube about what role they should play in intervening in the public sphere. And so, we've seen lots of controversies about the extent to which hate speech and misinformation that's sort of weaponized should be tolerated. And I think it's just a hugely consequential conversation. And I think the tech companies are beginning to understand their role as sort of public citizens. I think there's a lot that's left to be desired. And, I'm sort of working directly on some of these things. And I also think one of the things that everyone is having to think about is community context or country context. And so, Myanmar and Canada are very different places. It may be that certain places in the US are quite different than other places in the US. And so I think the specific community context of, for example, hate speech, misinformation, just gross like falsities in the area of public health and COVID, I think the companies and the public and regulators are really having to think hard about what is harm, what should we tolerate, where is free speech in all of this. So I think that's where the intersection of a lot of these different strands, you know, whether it's like climate justice and climate denial, or, you know, the vaccine that's on the horizon, hopefully, you know, soon. And then, you know, all the anti-vaxxer stuff that's going on, and how much I think, you know, the public, the companies, and government want to intervene. I just think there's just huge questions there. So I think that's going to be very consequential moving forward in our information age.
Thank you for that, John. I think that was a really great way to connect a lot of these pieces. Um, Lindsay, can I ask you to speak to these questions next in whatever way feels comfortable? Again, it was a very sprawling question.
Yeah, I'm actually going to come back to a point that Rashida had said to sort of build off of that, and just thinking about how re-entrenched we are, or how much we're trying to make sure technology is entrenched into our society, and really positioning it as a solution to many of our either social problems, and one of them being police brutality, of thinking that technology is a tool to solve that. And we see that through like the push of wanting to see police have body cams. So I'm going to do just a slight pivot, and then I'm going to come back to that. So I'm currently co-oping at the Center for Civil Rights and Restorative Justice, like Tony had shared. And so I think it's like looking, a lot of what I do is spend all day researching and reading a lot of news articles and police reports and those things around how the police have sort of framed their misconduct in what they have done around those things. And so there has been this long history of work to reform the police, to abolish the police. This isn't like a new moment around those things. That's been happening since the 30s and well before, the 1930s and before. But so today we're seeing just how what we're asking for reforms to be have sort of shifted and changed as technology, I think, has shifted and changed of what we want to see be done. And one of those has been around having police have body cams as a solution to the long legacy and even founding of police brutality as well. And so giving the police more money and more tools for things like body cameras can really just end up being used as another tool for police surveillance, and turning just a walk down the street into a way to surveil people around them, especially when there are things like facial recognition software inlaid with being able to use body cams, and thinking about that at protests, and how we're already over policing communities that we have talked about, but being able to see how, you know, police being overly present in those communities and then having these new forms of technology are then just creating continued over policing in those places. And so advances in sort of these forms of technology, while can have helpful solutions, can often actually just give more tools to create either a stronger narrative of why the police need more money, or around why like being able to only release body cam footage at certain moments and those things. So it's just being able to think about how these tools are being used across from police to hospitals to other forms of government use, to it's just that it's not neutral. Like having more technology is not just a neutral decision. It really can be used and manipulated.
Thank you, Lindsay. Those are great points. And I think touch back, as you noted, on some of the points Rashida raised about these movements in and of themselves being used as an opportunity to prevent more surveillance, right? The answer to police brutality being more surveillance, the answer to COVID being more tech and surveillance. What critical lessons about technology and artificial policy and policies related to both, I'm sorry, did I say artificial policy? I meant artificial information, policies related to both, and the intersection of social justice are we missing in this moment? I heard you all raise great questions. And I wondered if you wanted to take a crack at identifying some critical lessons that you feel are being missed from the lost in this discussion. And by that, I mean the broader public discussion, not the specific one. John, would you feel comfortable starting us off here?
So is your question about AI and machine learning and how that's being used? Is that what you were?
Yes, but it could be broader if you like, about tech policy more generally, if you'd like to delve into social media or anything else.
I mean, I guess, you know, I was trying to, I don't know if I made it very I don't know if I made a very good point prior, but I am interested in the ways in which surveillance databases that pull together from multiple streams. So for example, online purchases, social media posts, health records, facial recognition software, how those may or may not being used here in a domestic context. And I think, there are a lot of people working on ethical AI, and obviously, that's under Rashida's purview in her work. I I really think that we should be extremely concerned about how this data is being put together, because just because we know that how quickly otherwise anonymized data can become de-anonymized and then used in very insidious ways where there's no accountability. And we know, for example, the U.S. government does this globally, and using AI and machine learning to create vast databases, which can be data mined to try to do surveillance of sort of foreign enemies. But I'm really concerned about, for example, the use of federal agents in local contexts who do not have to necessarily follow the state or municipal laws. So for example, if police are supposed to have body cameras, the federal authorities and those agents, whether it's marshals or the FBI, or may not have to subscribe to those same rules. And so then I'm wondering, well, what kinds of other AI and machine learning technologies, which we know government has, could be used on citizens. So I'm really concerned about that.
Really appreciate you bringing in those points, John. I mean, in my prior work, not to take us on a tangent, but I advocated with communities to build resistance to certain federal surveillance policies, and the Joint Terrorism Task Forces are one entity that engages in a lot of surveillance of Muslim and other marginalized communities. And as you know, they involve not only FBI and Customs and Border Protection agents, ICE, but also the local police, even campus police. And you're right, they operate under those federal FBI guidelines, so a lot more leeway to engage in the types of, frankly, racial and political opinion profiling, religious profiling, other types of profiling, and that's a concerning intersection. But I apologize that seeing now that was a tangent, but I just wanted to appreciate that point.
No, it's good.
And maybe turn it over to you, Lindsay, next, if you feel comfortable. Ask if you feel that there are any critical lessons about tech policy or AI and social policy that we're missing that you would like to see, get more public attention, whether from your work advocating to the New York City Council or any other work that you want to bring in.
Yeah, so I guess I think about like two major themes, and I think I've touched on them briefly already, but all of these technology and all these other sort of social justice issues that we care about are deeply intertwined and cannot be separated or seen as independent of each other. And like what I had said in my last comment, that technology is not neutral. And so, we work on like one specific area that we're passionate about, what we often, as we often do, drilling down into a very specific area, we have to just ensure that we're sort of looking up and looking around and thinking about how what is we're advocating for right now going to impact the other movements of, for greater equity and liberation for our future. And so as we track where new forms of surveillance and technology by the police and government are cropping up, we'll often notice that it's being used on categories of people who are systematically viewed as more disposable. So I feel like part of, I thought about this for a minute when John was just talking about how seeing what's being used overseas by our military in other countries, what's being used in places that we may not be necessarily seeing it immediately, but then even in our own cities and in our own country, how are immigrants being treated, how are transgender people being treated, and how are forms of technology being used against those communities in particular. And so I think the part about technology not being neutral is that there's still someone who creates this, whether it's an algorithm or building the whatever new piece of software or whatever it is. So their sort of bias and their positionality in this world is being baked into these future forms of technology that can be used to really then create this like widespread bias with no particular person to be held accountable for it. And so I think there's this idea of technology just coming and not having those intrinsic things that we sometimes expect from certain people or from things of having this bias, but that is still very much the case. And I think it gets told or marketed to us as though it won't. But so whether it's from like housing justice to disability justice to queer justice, all of those things, there's implications for how technology is being used and surveillance is being used in those by police and the government in those sort of movements for liberation, and needing to think about how even things that may feel innate from a affordable housing complex moving to having key fobs as opposed to having like an actual physical key can actually then like track the movements of when people are coming in and out of places that may at first may feel like something that's not a big deal, but is actually kind of really large consequences for just what will that continue to look like and how is that setting the stage for future forms of surveillance.
Thank you, Lindsay. I think that's a really key point to underscore that does seem is getting missed in the public discourse about technology not being built by systems that have a lot of injustice and disparities built in. And I think particularly in the facial surveillance realm, as we hear public discourse challenging facial surveillance, too often we hear calls to improve it, to make it better, without this understanding that inevitably we're going to be drawing from existing states of social disparities and injustice. So I think that's a really important point to keep in mind. Rashida, could I ask you to sort of share your thoughts and conclusion on this particular topic of what critical lessons about AI or tech and are we missing?
So I kind of want to build off of what Lindsay was just discussing and name it as probably a problem outside of just the tech area, in that I think the problem with the approach to public policy in this country and most Western societies is that it's overly reductive of both the problems and potential solutions. And we see that almost exacerbated in the tech sector. And to give two examples of how this plays out in tech is, one, you either get this approach that I think we're seeing now with the facial recognition debate of we almost myopically focus on one technology and one application that's been demonstrated to be problematic, and that it helps us ignore or even gloss over and conceal other technologies that are already in use or equally problematic for the same reasons. And that's in part because we're not able to have these more robust conversations about data collection practices and the sort of R&D pipeline in tech. And it's also because we have this kind of perverted way of talking about tech, in that we never actually talk about what is the problem or what is our vision for an alternative and what is the role of tech. It's always just like tech is a solution to some amorphous problem and it will just put it in the universe and it will solve everything. And I think the other problem that stems from that sort of reductive approach to policy is what we've seen both here and in Europe, of this sectoral approach of like only looking at uses that are the most obvious. And there's some tension there in that, like, we focus on policing, we focus on the criminal justice system because it is a very problematic actor, and that liberty is at stake to any type of decision or use of technology in that sector. But if we only focus on the most obvious problems in the same way with facial recognition and ignoring other technologies, we also ignore other uses and problematic practices. So police and child welfare use predictive analytics in the same harmful ways, and their outcomes completely hurt someone's trajectory of their life and their community in the same ways, because they're two forms of government that have the same type of coercive power when used in society. So when you only look at police, when you only look at certain sectors, it allows these other uses, which are equally harmful, to seem permissible either legally or socially. And that makes it harder to do more comprehensive or even larger structural reform in the end, because we're only focusing on what's most immediate or what certain actors are telling us is most urgent. So I think that's kind of the problem we're facing right now, but also the opportunity that I already mentioned is like we're starting to have these more expansive conversations. We need to talk about harm, like who is actually being harmed, rather than just abstract harm of all of like, we're all affected by facial recognition. And it's like, yeah, we are, but I'm probably affected more because it doesn't work for me. So I think if we sort of continue with the momentum in solidarity that is growing right now, hopefully we can see a pivot out of what I see as just a cycle of how we've done public policy in this country, of seeing problems as like these neat packaged things that can be solved by one little tech or other solution, and then it's off the table for the next 20 years.
Thank you for that, Rashida. That's such a key point about, you know, these siloed discussions about tech and its implications. And too often, I think, giving certain trusted actors a pass and just accepting that, well, these are benign uses, but we just have to look out for these scrutinized uses, and missing the big picture and the potential harms. And that's sort of actually a good segue, I think, to our last question. Where do we go from here? And I invite you to answer that in a couple of ways, if you'll permit. Which may not be maybe more troubled or pessimistic view, and where do you think we should go from here? Could I ask you, Lindsay, actually to start us off on that topic?
Yeah, I think this is just such a both exciting and challenging question in thinking about this. And I'm really, again, just thinking around what Rashida had shared around not narrowing in too much on something like the police or some other specific, whether it's like org or function, and just thinking expansively and how even thinking about like a positive framing company or nonprofit. I'm thinking of one that I've done some research on that's called Thorn, that's out of California. That's their missions around ending child sex trafficking, but what they're actually creating is this database around being able to, it's been a while since I remembered this, so if I apologize if any of this is in not totally correct, but around creating a database around trying to basically like go through the internet around like any like sex work that's being done. And so they're saying, having their messages around ending child sex trafficking, but it's having these broader implications and basically allowing police to then also be able to use it. But on the front facing, it's seeming as this really great nonprofit. And so I think part of this, like looking expansively, like Rashida had said, of being critical and asking really critical questions anytime that we're implementing something like this in all of these places, because it will continue to be used and manipulated in growing forms of the government. And so so thinking in that way expansively, but also the importance of from being, you know, lawyers and journalists to community organizing and people in communities that are overly surveilled, of being able to have sort of solidarity across these places where I feel like there often can be a divide around some like institutional policy government work and then on the ground organizing work, and having sort of those things be continue to be more melded together, I think is an important step in thinking about as we continue to move forward and where we go in being able to create more change and more accountability and transparency that's needed as some of these things are already happening. These forms of technology are already being used. And so I think that's a really important piece of many people just don't even know that they're being utilized. And part of it is if like thinking about like what's happening with the NYPD, like now the Post Act was just passed in New York City, and having to have the public actually now getting to know what forms of surveillance the police are using is, I think, one of those steps, along with ensuring that any new things are being very critically examined.
Thank you, Lindsay. Empowering the people who are impacted with information is such a crucial element. Could I ask you, Rashida, to go next and speak to, you know, where do we go from here? Both where do you see us going and where do you think we should be going?
Yeah, I think as a global society, we just need to start having frank conversations about what would a inclusive society look like and how do we get there? Because I don't think tech and surveillance needs to be a separate conversation. As I mentioned, it's a tool. So to what extent it can help advance that vision is something to be figured out. But I think the problem is we don't have as much imagination for radical alternatives. And when you don't have that sort of vision for where you're going, then it's easy to supplant it with many ideas that are already in place. And I know this is like the thing I tell myself I need to work on, because I think as a lawyer, especially as a lawyer working in social justice issues, we're so used to having to be reactive because it's just so many things coming in from every direction. And I'm very good at figuring out their strategies for like how to subvert current power players and how to think through sort of the incremental step to get us to the next place. But where I struggle is, if tomorrow we woke up and we could just press restart, what would the new thing be? And then figuring out what needs to fall in line to help that is the thing I'm always stuck on, because we don't allow ourselves that time to like think through the alternatives. But I think that is the sort of deeper and harder work we need to start doing now, because otherwise we'll sort of continue in this path of like entrenching the status quo in even more harmful ways. And one way I think to sort of advance that is expanding like who's in the room having conversations about the sort of where society is going, but also in tech development. In that, like, I always make the crass remark in like CS and more technical spaces of, I don't understand how someone who's probably read the Wikipedia page on educational equity for a few months then thinks they can apply machine learning to come up with a solution to problems that people have worked their entire careers and haven't quite figured out. So it's like, I don't think we're going to get there tomorrow, because obviously this is the harder work we need to do. But how do we also make sure that it's not sort of the same people having the same conversations to end up with the same solutions in the end? So that wasn't really a like next step for where we go, but I do think that's sort of the like macro level work that needs to be done right now.
Thank you, Rashida. I think that actually is very helpful in framing this and thinking about the fact that we're in this transformational moment, potentially so much opportunity, but our sort of our more practiced skills in defending and being on, being on the reactive may not serve us as well, and we really don't want to lose this moment. We need to think about a vision and what we want going forward. Can I ask you, John, to conclude us on this question, and then after that, we'll give each of you an opportunity to pose one as well.
Sure, and it's hard to follow actually what Lindsay and Rashida said, but I guess I'll turn it back to journalism for a moment. So you all know that the business model for journalism is in great crisis, and there are many fewer investigative reporters. There are many fewer reporters in state capitals. The capacity of news media to hold power to account is just diminished. And at the same time, obviously, the president and his allies have been, really chipping away at the broad public trust that news media once had, rightly or wrongly, 30 or 40 years ago. I actually just want to end maybe with like a call for civil society institutions and academia and journalism to do more collaborations. There's an emerging field in journalism, although beleaguered, around algorithmic accountability. And this is, everything from thinking about sentencing algorithms to the way in which algorithms may differentiate on prices or real estate, sort of neo-redlining. I mean, there's a whole bunch of justice and equity issues that are implicated. And I think journalism still has this role as a convener, in forming these sort of networked publics, these networks of recognition. But I think we really need capacity. We need really smart people like Lindsay and Shannon and Tony and Rashida to be partnering with journalists to help us understand how these algorithmic systems may be working, and then to really interrogate them And we've seen some really effective collaborations across the country, whether it's the New York Times or ProPublica. But there are many other, smaller journalism outlets that could use a hand in getting in trying to understand this stuff. So I would just ask that everyone think about how they can help boost local journalism, regional journalism, national journalism in this respect of algorithmic accountability.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. I think that's a really concrete next step that we can all think about and how it relates to our individual work and collective work. So now I'm going to give each of you an opportunity before we turn it back to Tony for Q&A to pose a question either for one another or for the audience. Rashida, why don't we start with you? What would you?
So I'm going to apologize before I do this to my co-panelists and to the audience, because this is kind of a selfish question. And I want to know, what is the use of big data or data-driven technology? Like, what's the problem that you think big data or data-driven technologies could actually be leveraged to solve? And the context for why I'm asking this is because so much of my job and work is criticizing every idea that people have, that like I often struggle with this question of like, what's a good example? Because like everyone wants to hear something good after I trash everything. So there's my question to you all.
So I think anybody from the audience as well, that sounds like, could chime in on this. If you want to raise a hand, feel free. Or I sometimes have trouble finding my hand raise opportunity. You can just chat RTS, request to speak, and I'll call on you. Anybody feel brave and wanting to take on this answer, just from your perspective?
So I see Sarah responded public health. Sarah, if you could get on the mic and tell us, elaborate a little bit more on your response. We'd love to hear it.
Hi, sure. And sorry, I don't have my my video on. Sure, I spent almost a decade in the Middle East and Africa working in public health and social welfare systems. And I think that there's a lot of criticism, for example, with what Google and Amazon have been doing in regard to their different health projects and collaborations with hospitals. But again, to the extent that patient data is secure and data is anonymized, you can get great insights into hopefully getting out in front of diseases and illnesses, and trying to get more toward a preventative, approach. Just looking at comorbidities, for example. And right now, as an example, unfortunately, we're already into double and triple comorbidities now, sort of what we expect to see as the future of our health system. So, I think that there's a lot that we can gain, again, if it's anonymized, and then also have the ability to look longitudinally.
Thank you, Sarah. And I hear a key sort of theme in that being anonymized data, right? And that type of data being useful. And I think, you and probably the full audience and all the panelists have also awareness of the ways in which, public health is a very expansive concept, can in some cases be used to criminalize marginalized communities as well, right? Whether it be in the context of pregnant people who are receiving public health insurance being, surveilled through the questions that they have to answer to receive that help, or even the orientation for purpose of recruiting non-law enforcement actors who are more trusted in the community to gather ideological information about people. But in no way do I take that to be the point that you were making. I just wanted to draw a distinction between sort of what you're talking about, anonymized data. If you had any reaction on that.
Sorry, you broke up at the end. I didn't hear the last question.
I just wanted to give you a chance to react if you wanted to, no worries.
Oh, Well, I've actually critiqued a lot of public health models, in part because I do think Sarah's right in that there are opportunities, but there's also a lot of entrenched problems, especially when you look at race, gender, and socioeconomic status and how cultural views become embedded in that health data. So even a good example is actually this healthcare algorithm that's being investigated in New York and a few other states, where initially they used insurance information to try to help triage who would need more care in the emergency room. And obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but the outcome was that it was a racialized outcome in that Black patients received less care and white patients received more. And it was because they were looking at insurance payments. And that falls along both racial and socioeconomic lines of who has insurance and who can afford to pay for all care. And if that's the data you're using, then it's more likely to reflect the social inequities embedded in that space. But and I think that's kind of the trade-off in all sectors. And this is why I struggle with this question, is like, there are opportunities and that's why tech is a tool, but how it's applied and to what problems it's applied and to whose worldview it's optimizing are kind of like the key questions that need to be asked for all. So that's all to say, like, I guess this was a cheat question in that, like, I do think there's opportunities in all sectors, but there's definitely challenges because we don't live in an equitable society and our data reflects that. So when you apply that historical data at scale, it's more likely to perpetuate and amplify the problems we have in society. And how do you kind of curtail that for good is the question we're kind of struggling with in the space.
Yeah, sorry. I'll just offer the one last thing, Rashida, is because I completely agree with you. I mean, I think that there's a lot of risk there. And even looking, for example, at some of the diagnostic tools and decision trees that are out there, that, you know, there's incredible bias that are baked in, you know, similar to what we're seeing in a lot of the AI and the algorithmic, you know, programs that John mentioned. But this is where I really see it as sort of a, you know, needing to come together across sectors. I've just recently spent a lot of time in women's empowerment, for example, and, you know, just introducing gender lens, for example, and sort of what that means and bringing that, and, you know, now working with a tech company and bringing in, you know, sort of a socioeconomic and race lens. You know, I just think that we speak sort of different languages in a sense, and it really needs to be a coming together where we work in partnership so that it's not, you know, a lot of the folks I worked with previously in my career, you know, coming out of the, you know, the big tech places, designing decision trees, for example, using mobile tech, you know, but really not having any of that understanding either of indigenous cultures or, you know, even proper survey methods, for example, that are non-biased in their language and even question structure. So I think this is a huge opportunity. And if you guys have any recommendations as far as organizations that are doing this to sort of bring more racial literacy, if that's even what it's called, into, you know, different disciplines, you know, I'd love to get that information. Thanks.
Thanks for raising those points, for your courage, frankly, and being the one to respond to Rashida's questions, Susan, and for surfacing is really important points. I think your most recent, you just touched on a really important point that John had made as well about where we go forward from here and drawing on collective expertise and working together, right? And also just the fact that you raised public health. It's clearly a topic that's really relevant for surveillance, and appreciate your bringing that up. I'm going to turn it over to John and give you, actually, I also just want to say that if people do have ideas for Susan in response to her last question about organizations that are sort of expert in racial justice, and you want to, I'm just going to volunteer that you could put them in the chat if that's okay too, so that we don't lose that thread. John, would you like to go next in terms of posting?
I'm sorry, Shannon, I lost your sentence.
I'm sorry, I think my
okay.
audio is
That's
a little
okay.
fraught.
Yeah, that's okay.
I just wanted to ask if you would like to go next and pose a question either for the audience or your co-panelists.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe ask Lindsay a little bit more about restorative justice, because I'm really interested in it as a concept. I remember first encountering it in a sociology class when I was an undergraduate, which was actually a very long time ago. And it's really become, I think, a very key, necessary concept in our time. And I'm also, but you know, with respect to the theme of our talk today, like interested in that intersection between surveillance and restorative justice, and ways in which that surveillance culture, surveillance capitalism might undermine the potential for kind of progressive restorative justice efforts. And I don't know, I was just if you could speak to that, I'd be very interested.
Yeah, I don't know how much I'll be able to share about that, but also would be happy to have if Rashida or other panel or other members of the audience. I guess I think about restorative justice as just being the alternative to thinking as punishment as the solution, and so being able to have thinking about like, what do the person who's actually been harmed in the situation, what do they want and what do they need to feel whole? And so you know, punishment model, which is really the model that we live in the United States, of the prisons and the criminal justice system, is that punishment is what will make safety for us, as opposed to thinking about how when we inevitably enact harm, which I think everyone here has at some point enacted some form of harm, whether or not we were policed for doing it is often the question. And I think that relates to, you know, some of the surveillance things of like, when we create harm, is there either who has caught that, how is our community being surveilled, and how does surveillance continue to create a more sort of like always being watched feeling, and always possibly being able to like be in trouble for what you do. So I don't know if I necessarily have like a great answer for you around that, but just trying to think about how we can have like some of the like reframe that I see in some neighborhoods is, instead of like neighborhood watch, it's like, I'm your neighbor and I'm here to support you, as opposed to I'm watching you. And thinking about how that feels like a frame from punishment to restorative justice, in terms of if something bad or wrong happens or someone enacts harm, how to have accountability that doesn't rely on some of these other institutions that we have used to be able to try to create safety, when like really like the neighborhoods that have the most safety are the ones with the most resources and the ones who are the most well connected. And I think when we start relying on surveillance as a form of creating safety, it really doesn't create that. It just creates more opportunities for harm and punishment.
Yeah, that's really insightful. And I guess I've been thinking about restorative justice as the capacity to have a fresh start in the world, and to come back, you know, from some adversity. And it does seem like surveillance culture has associated with it this kind of persistence of data, which, you know, could leave these long data traces that can follow people, and would undermine the capacity for restorative justice. I've had friends who've, you know, committed some minor offense, you know, 20 or 30 years ago, and it follows them around. I'm thinking in particular of a white person. I can only imagine what it's like for marginalized communities. So anyway, thank you for that. And
yeah, like Mariah had just said in the chat, thinking about the surveillance of formerly incarcerated people, and thinking about ankle monitoring and all of those things, and how that again just reenacts punishment instead of forms of having of creating this sort of moment of being able to have repair as opposed to punishment.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lindsay. And can I ask you actually to pose your own question?
Yeah, so I guess I think we often will discuss and analyze things maybe from a distance, or from that's happening somewhere else, or not in our own neighborhood or community or school or workplace. And so I'm wondering, because I know many of the folks who are here at Northeastern, but like what forms of like surveillance are you seeing maybe here at Northeastern University, or in your school or your neighborhood or workplace, if you're not at Northeastern, that are either ripe for misuse or that you have privacy concerns about? Because I think if we don't know what those are, I think it's just because we're not looking, not because it's not there.
So again, I'm inviting the panelists, but also our audience members to respond to this as well. Feel free to get on the mic.
Well, I feel like it's unfair if I answer because this is actually my job to know this stuff, but I'll answer in a way that hopefully can open the conversation. And it also touches on the point Lindsay made in her last comments. And I think it, like, often our view of even how we look at what is surveillance is kind of formed by the limited view and sort of limited narrative and legal arguments made around it. And to just clarify what I'm saying, one example I use is that, like, a lot of our discussion of surveillance of communities often focuses on the practices of police in the criminal justice system, but we don't have the same level of outrage or even public interest in practices by, like, child welfare and public benefit agencies, which ask equally intrusive questions and are equally invasive as other bodies in government. And it just forces this question of, why don't we see those things as similar when they're really the same practices of data collection, data use, informing decisions based on cultural understandings of certain groups? Like, it's all of the same thing. So this doesn't answer the question, but more poses it of, like, thinking about the way forms of surveillance that we've normalized or may not even notice or have the same level of outrage about, but are there and kind of have been there for the same amount of time as other things that are a little bit more apparent.
Brilliant, and I don't think unfair at all, Rashida, for you to share that. It's really helpful. Helpful framing. Any last thoughts on that question from Lindsay about what people are seeing at Northeastern?
I mean, just like thinking about, like, I think we have, like, now an app that we're supposed to be checking into when we're going to be coming onto campus, and be just having more of, like, where we are and when we are, and even things like swiping into buildings, and how COVID has really created a world where, like, knowing where we are and whether we're on campus or not, I think is just something to just be curious and critical about. And right now it might not, it's like, this might be, there might be lots of reasons why this is important, but what can be done with that information?
Can I just maybe just add one thing here? I actually do a little bit with the IT folks at Northeastern, and I do really worry about cybersecurity over time. The more data that universities collect, and especially once they get not just into the the education records, but the more they get into, like, health records, so not just FERPA but HIPAA, the more, and basically assemble very large databases with individually identified records. I very much worry about hackers over time, and universities on the whole, and I can't speak to Northeastern relative to other universities, but universities relative to other large institutions, I think, are behind on cybersecurity. And I think that should be really worrisome, and we should be asking a lot of questions.
Thank you, John. I think this has been a really robust conversation, and we've covered so much important ground. I'm going to turn it over to Tony for the remaining minutes for Q&A.
Absolutely. So from the questions that we do have, I will say that I know we're going to go a bit over time, so I'm going to apologize in advance and say to anyone that has to leave, we totally understand, and want to just thank you for being here and participating and engaging with us thus far. This is the portion where the audience, some folks have actually shared questions in the chat, some have sent me private messages, and some of the questions that were raised were actually answered in our discussion. So I actually want to invite those of you who are on the call with us, or in the Zoom room with us, to get on the microphone, and you don't have to turn on your camera, but we would love for you to be able to ask your question to our panelists directly. And the first person I have on that list is Tamar. Tamar, are you there? Okay.
Hi, Tony.
Oh, there you are. Okay, great.
Hi, sorry, I had a technological glitch. Is it? I'm not sure. I must have missed, but is it okay if I pose my question now?
Absolutely, yes, please.
Okay, perfect. Thank you to the panel. I was just thinking kind of about, I think some of you mentioned the policy cameras, the health data that is being collected. How, I was wondering if you could touch on kind of the benefits and what balancing act would make collecting the data okay? Would anonymization work? Would pseudonymization work? What metrics would need to be in place for, police carrying cameras to actually protect both policemen and the public, or student health records to actually mitigate spread of disease? How do you see that?
So there is not a one-size-fits-all sort of approach to data regulation or governance, really, because even of the examples you mentioned, there's different risk of harms to each use. So anonymization may work in one sector, but not actually help in another, depending on the social inequities embedded in that sector. But separate from that, there is emerging research on better data practices. So I think it was 2 years ago, Microsoft came out with a paper, Data Sheets for Data Sets, which is essentially a documentation process when creating a data set. So you understand sort of the normative values and logic of the person creating the data set for subsequent use, because that's so much of many of the problems we're talking about with the amplification of social inequities and other issues is that, like, data is not objective, and it's also not a direct reflection of reality. It's what you choose to collect, how you choose to present it, how you choose to organize it, and ultimately what you're creating a data set about is a series of subjective decisions made by someone creating that data set. And the only way you can really try to sort of dislodge some of the social issues embedded in those data sets is to have a better understanding of how it was created. So then when designing a system using that data, you can either try to adjust, or you're at least aware of the sort of deficiencies in that underlying data. And I think like even this example is why it's such a challenging thing to regulate, is because there's so many nuances. So really the most prominent approaches are better approaches to documenting what you're doing, better model development and document solve the problem if the sort of underlying logic or inherent approach to designing that tech is flawed as well.
Do any of our other panelists want to weigh in before we move to the next question? Okay. So next on our list is Sarah. Sarah, you've asked quite a few questions, and just in the interest of time, wondering if you can choose one of the questions, one of kind of your most pressing question, and pose it to our panelists.
Sure, thank you so much. I'm curious, really again around policy and legislation. I just remember watching, I think it was on C-SPAN, the congressional, I don't know, deliberations related to drones a number of years ago, and we were just, years and years behind on the policymaking side of things. And so I'm wondering, where should we, both as individual citizens, but also, different types of advocacy groups be headed in trying to collaborate with lawmakers to get out in front of issues that, I say get out in front of, I think they're probably already here. So I guess the question is sort of what legislation or policies are we missing that stand to, again, potentially cause us huge issues as we're playing catch up as far as our civil liberties and civil rights, and or that stand to potentially stymie our industries, as was the case obviously with drones. I think it was in both of those examples were the case in drones, both privacy issues and stymied, our private sector industry vis-a-vis other countries.
I can take it. So there's a few different things going on. I think here in the US, because tech policy has always been behind, like it's something where it's the case law defining what we're doing. Most laws dealing with even data collection and data use were passed in the 80s. So we're just a slow country with regulating tech generally. And I think one of what's been happening is you're seeing more local and state action that's with the hope is that it creates a patchwork, and then it forces the conversation on the Hill about what more comprehensive reform needs to look like. And I think the best way to describe some of the legislative activism that's happening is there's a big push for greater transparency, and part of that, and Lindsay included one that I actually wrote, the Post Act. And that's like an effort. And I see a lot of transparency efforts more as diagnostic tools. They're not solutions to these problems, but more if we don't have a good grasp on even what is going on, how are we going to come up with comprehensive solutions? So the first step is to have better understanding of what is going on in government, how tech is becoming so embedded in certain sectors than others, and then trying to think through what is a comprehensive approach to addressing that. I also think there needs to be more education of legislators. I can't tell you the amount of meetings I've been in and the sort of basic level questions you get. And I even did a Senate hearing last year where it's like the part of the job is controlling your face with the questions that you're getting from legislators, because you see the big disconnect in their understanding of issues and where we are actually as a society and what needs to be done. So I think there definitely needs to be more work and education from different groups, both on the Hill and on the state and local level, because what's really happening is you have a strong sort of tech lobby that's doing a lot of the information sharing, and that's leading to a stagnation in any type of reform that is possible. But I think if there was more of a multitude of voices sort of framing the issue and helping legislators understand sort of the scope of harm, then we could see more action.
So I'm taking copious notes as you're also speaking. But yes, all really good points. Thank you, Rashida, and thank you, Sarah, for your question. We're going to turn it over to Amy, who will get the final question of our session today. Amy, do you mind getting on the mic to ask your question? Okay. Amy may have stepped away. I know that we're a bit over time. So with that in mind, I will open the floor up one more time. If anyone has any final questions, I would invite you to get on the mic. And if not, we are going to wrap up.
Just a quick one. I was just curious to what extent the organization might be playing sort of a convening role, or yeah, I guess if there's, again, I'm going to look back in the comments in the chats, but sort of where do we go from here if we're trying to sort of find, like-minded people, or where there might be these collaboration opportunities that John spoke about.
So questions about, so Sarah's question is about collaboration, any organizations that are doing work in this space around tech inclusion and tech justice and its connection, and specifically as it relates to policy. Am I understanding that right, Sarah?
Sorry. Yeah, just again, in general, sort of where do we go from here? I'm just interested again in staying involved and connected. I mean, in a very practical sense.
So there's a few different orgs. There's Data for Black Lives. They do both policy advocacy and research. STOP, which Lindsay just worked at, which is the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. And they're based here in New York City and perform both public research and mostly policy advocacy and litigation. There's Upturn, which is based in DC. They perform a lot of research around both applications of AI and social implications and the policy realm. I would say AI Now too, but I just left and I did all of that work. So hopefully they'll find someone and continue with it. And then I think there's a lot of groups that service as conveners in a way, but may not actually be active, but more bringing people together to talk about the issues in more of an academic setting, which is different from policy advocacy, but still useful. And so you have, I'm trying to think specifically in Boston, so you have the Berkman Klein Center, and okay, now I'm blanking. You have ACLUs, but I have a lot of negative feelings about them as an organization, which I can do offline, but they're doing the work. Brennan Center, and then NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Like, there's a lot of legal organizations that are expanding their legislative advocacy and litigation work into these areas. So I think it's just paying attention to social justice orgs in this space, because they do have work that is both interdisciplinary and intersectional in looking at these issues. And then there's a handful of more research-oriented organizations that do have policy arms, and those are the ones that I listed.
Thanks, Rashida, and thank you, Sarah, for your last question. Or your response to the last question, rather. So that concludes today's session. Thank you to everyone for sticking with us, for your questions, for your comments. Thank you to our panelists for participating. This actually concludes the end of CLIC's summer series, Scrutinizing Surveillance, but clearly we have much more to talk about, and so please look out for future events that we are going to host around issues of surveillance, the use of technology, its impact on our democracy, which reminds me to tell everybody about CLIC's upcoming fall conference on the future of democracy and the regulation of IP and tech in our current democratic moment. That is on October 16th, and we are happy to share that with you. If you want to get on our list, or you want to follow us, or if you want to message me directly, I'd be happy to keep you connected and keep in touch. I want to thank you all again and encourage everyone to continue these conversations, whether you're following each other online or reading some of the articles. Actually, for those of you who registered, we did list a bunch of articles that are connected to all of the issues that we've covered over the course of this series, and would encourage you, if you want to do some more reading, to also to check those out as well. Thank you, Shannon, and to CIPIAC for co-hosting this event, and we look forward to seeing you at CLIC's next event. Bye, everyone.